The story does not begin with gunfire, marches, or shouted demands. It begins in silence, in rooms where the air barely moved, where tall windows filtered pale light onto polished tables, and where numbers mattered more than lives. Leather-bound ledgers lay open, ink dried slowly on paper. Men spoke in low voices, not about ideals, but about balances, reserves, and survival. Far from the colony itself, decisions were being made that would shape its future without ever mentioning its name. An empire, stretched thin and surrounded by rivals, had reached a moment of quiet fear. It needed to survive, and survival, in the modern world, demanded money, not pride, not ceremony. Money, credit, and control. This was the unspoken rule of empire. When borders expanded faster than resources, when wars cost more than victories delivered, power no longer came from flags or fleets alone. It came from who could pay, who could borrow, and who could delay payment the longest. The empire had armies, ships, and global reach, but those instruments burned capital at an alarming rate. Wars drained treasuries faster than they could be replenished. Rivals circled, watching closely for weakness. Creditors demanded reassurance. Survival was no longer about conquest. It was about liquidity. And the empire knew exactly where to find it. The colony was not an afterthought. It was the crown jewel, vast, productive, and tightly controlled. It generated raw materials, labor, and trade flows on a scale few regions in the world could match. It had ports that never slept, railways that cut through the interior like veins, and factories that filled the air with smoke and motion. From the outside, it looked like proof of imperial success. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The contrarian truth is uncomfortable, but essential to understand. The colony was not ruined because it was weak. It was not destroyed by chaos or incompetence. It was ruined because it was too valuable to be allowed to fail. As pressure mounted at the center, the empire leaned harder on what it controlled best. Loyalty became obligation. Obligation became policy. Policy became debt. The colony was asked to contribute more, then told it must. Emergency measures were framed as temporary necessities. Wartime arrangements were described as short-term sacrifices. Each request sounded reasonable on its own. Each one promised stability in exchange for patience. But together, they formed a system that redirected wealth steadily and legally away from where it was created. Think about the mechanics of that shift. No soldiers were sent to seize vaults. No proclamations announced mass confiscation. Instead, trade terms were adjusted. Payments were delayed. Earnings were held in accounts the colony could not access. Local surpluses were converted into credits recorded elsewhere. On paper, nothing looked stolen. Everything was accounted for. That was the genius of the system. Extraction without spectacle. Control without chaos. On the ground, life continued. Ports stayed crowded with ships loading and unloading goods bound for distant markets. Trains thundered across the landscape, carrying minerals, crops, and manufactured products. Factories ran long hours, their machines clattering through the night. Employment existed. Production expanded. To an outside observer, it looked like growth. But beneath the noise and motion, something was quietly changing. Wealth was flowing in only one direction, away from the colony, toward the imperial center. The more the colony produced, the less it seemed to have. This contradiction is the heart of the story. Production rose, yet purchasing power weakened. Output increased, yet local savings shrank. Work intensified, yet prosperity failed to arrive. It was an economic paradox that could only exist under conditions of extreme control. The colony was working harder to fund survival elsewhere, and it was doing so without ever being asked if it agreed. The empire justified this arrangement as necessary. Survival demanded sacrifice. The world was unstable. Rivals were aggressive. Markets were unforgiving. These arguments were repeated often and rarely questioned. After all, the colony was part of something larger. Its fate was tied to imperial strength, or so the story went. But strength, in this case, meant the ability to shift pain outward. Every financial buffer created at the center was paid for by tightening conditions at the edge. What made the system so effective was its invisibility. There were no dramatic moments to mark the turning point. No single law or decree that could be blamed. Instead, control grew through routines, through accounting rules, through currency arrangements that seemed technical and harmless, through trade systems that locked the colony into selling low and buying high, through financial controls that decided when, where, and if earnings could be used. It was governance by spreadsheet, not by sword. Imagine a worker producing goods every day, watching trucks carry them away, knowing the value is real, yet never seeing that value return. Now scale that feeling to an entire society. The colony's labor-generated wealth measured in exports and balances, but daily life grew more constrained. Prices crept upward. Access to capital tightened. Opportunities for local investment diminished. None of this happened overnight. That was the point. Slow change draws less resistance. At the imperial center, the story looked very different. Accounts stabilized. Currency pressures eased. Creditors were reassured. Wars could be financed without immediate collapse. Survival was achieved, at least for the moment. The colony had done its job, or rather, it had been made to do it. The empire survived crisis after crisis by drawing from a source that seemed endless. Few stopped to ask what this meant for the future of that source. This is where the stakes sharpen. An empire can survive many things: military defeat, political unrest, even loss of territory. But it cannot survive indefinitely by hollowing out its own foundation. The colony was not a side project. It was central to imperial strength. Weakening it meant weakening the system that depended on it. Yet short-term survival always feels more urgent than long-term stability, especially in moments of fear. The question hanging over the story is not whether the empire acted rationally. It did, according to priorities. The real question is whether the outcome was ever avoidable. Could an empire under existential pressure have chosen restraint? Could it have allowed the colony to retain its wealth while still financing its own survival? Or was collapse built into the strategy the moment extraction replaced partnership? This is not a tale of sudden theft or dramatic betrayal. It is a story of gradual suffocation, of emergency measures that never ended, of systems designed to be temporary that became permanent because they worked too well. Legal, ordered, devastating. By the time the consequences became visible, the mechanisms were deeply entrenched, and reversal was no longer simple. The colony did not fall in flames. It weakened in silence. Its resources funded distant decisions. Its labor stabilized foreign markets. Its wealth underwrote wars fought far from its shores. And all of this happened while the empire told itself it was doing what had to be done: survival first, consequences later. As this story unfolds, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers through balance sheets and trade agreements. Sometimes it hides behind the language of necessity. And sometimes the greatest damage is done not by enemies, but by the very system that claims to offer protection. For a long time, the arrangement looked like success. From a distance, the colony appeared unstoppable, a vast engine of growth powering the empire's global reach. Its land stretched wide and fertile. Its mines cut deep into the earth, pulling out minerals that fed factories half a world away. Its fields produced crops in volumes that reshaped global markets. Labor was abundant, disciplined, and cheap by imperial design. To outsiders, this was a model colony, proof that the system worked. Numbers supported the image. Exports rose year after year. Trade volumes expanded. Shipping lanes grew crowded with vessels carrying the colony's output to distant ports. On paper, the empire looked richer than ever. Cities within the colony began to swell. Urban centers expanded outward as new workers arrived in search of opportunity. Railways carved through forests and plains, stitching together regions that had once been isolated. Stations became hubs of activity, filled with goods, noise, and motion. Ports glittered with cranes, warehouses, and stacks of cargo waiting to be loaded. The physical signs of development were everywhere. Steel, stone, and steam told a convincing story. From the outside, it looked like progress. From the inside, it felt like momentum. Employment spread across industries tied directly to imperial demand. Mining, agriculture, transport, and basic manufacturing all grew rapidly. For many, this was the first time steady wages were available at scale. The rhythm of work changed daily life. Money circulated more visibly than before. Shops opened. Markets grew denser. The empire pointed to these changes as evidence of benevolent rule. Infrastructure was presented as a gift. Growth was framed as partnership. The colony, they claimed, was being lifted into the modern world. But this strength was carefully staged. The visible expansion masked a deeper imbalance built into the system itself. The colony did not control the terms under which it traded. Prices for its exports were set elsewhere. The value of its currency was anchored to imperial priorities, not local needs. Its financial institutions answered to authorities far beyond its borders. Savings generated within the colony did not remain there by default. They moved through channels designed to redirect them outward. On balance sheets, profits appeared impressive. But where those profits were recorded mattered more than how large they were. Much of the surplus generated by colonial production never entered the local economy in a meaningful way. It was booked, managed, and deployed by imperial institutions. Decisions about reinvestment were made with the empire's stability in mind, not the colony's long-term development. What appeared locally as investment was often something else entirely. It was repayment. It was obligation. It was leverage. The illusion worked because it relied on motion rather than ownership. Factories operated continuously, but ownership of capital remained external. Railways expanded, but revenue streams flowed outward. Ports bustled, but control over shipping and insurance lay elsewhere. The colony functioned like a machine that never shut down, yet never held the keys to its own engine. Imagine a factory that runs day and night, producing value at full capacity, but never owns its machines, its output, or its profits. That factory looks productive. It is not prosperous. The empire understood this distinction very well. Productivity was encouraged. Autonomy was not. The goal was not to build a self-sustaining economy in the colony. The goal was to maintain a reliable source of surplus that could be mobilized when needed. As long as goods flowed and accounts balanced, the system was considered healthy. The colony's role was to produce. The empire's role was to decide. Trade agreements reinforced this imbalance. The colony exported raw materials and low-value goods, while importing finished products at higher prices. This structure locked it into a dependent position, where growth increased volume but not value. The more it produced, the more it relied on external markets and decisions. Industrial maturity was delayed, sometimes deliberately. Industries that might compete with imperial producers were discouraged or restricted. Development was allowed, but only up to a point. Currency arrangements added another layer of control. The colony's financial stability was tied to imperial currency systems. Exchange rates favored the center. Monetary policy served external needs. This meant local economic shocks could not be managed independently. Inflation, shortages, and credit constraints were absorbed by the population, while financial buffers were preserved elsewhere. To the empire, this was prudent management. To the colony, it was quiet vulnerability. Despite these structural weaknesses, confidence remained high. Imperial leaders pointed to steady growth as proof that the model worked. Creditors saw rising trade numbers and felt reassured. Investors saw infrastructure and assumed stability. Even within the colony, many believed that continued participation would eventually bring full prosperity. After all, the trains kept running. The port stayed busy. Wages, though limited, were paid. The system did not feel broken. It felt incomplete. This sense of inevitability was powerful. The idea that the colony was on a clear path towards shared prosperity became part of the narrative. Sacrifices were framed as investments in a common future. Temporary constraints were justified by long-term gains. The language of patience filled speeches and reports. Few questioned who defined the timeline or who controlled the destination. The empire believed it had engineered the perfect system. A colony productive enough to support wars, stabilize currency, and reassure global markets. A territory large enough to absorb shocks without immediate collapse. A population numerous enough to supply labor without demanding leverage. It was a system built on asymmetry, and asymmetry was its strength. As long as pressure flowed one way, the structure held. Yet this confidence rested on a fragile assumption. It assumed the flow of value would never slow. It assumed global demand would remain constant. It assumed the colony could absorb endless extraction without consequence. These assumptions went largely untested during periods of expansion. Growth has a way of hiding imbalance. When everything is moving forward, weaknesses remain buried beneath momentum. Few asked what would happen if conditions changed. What if demand fell? What if war intensified? What if the empire's needs suddenly multiplied? The system had no built-in mechanism to protect the colony under stress. Its purpose was to protect the center. That was the design. In calm times, this distinction seemed theoretical. In crisis, it would become decisive. The illusion of strength was convincing because it was visible. Steel rails, crowded docks, expanding cities. These were tangible signs people could point to. Structural weakness, by contrast, lived in documents, contracts, and accounting practices few ever saw. It lived in the absence of local control, in the quiet redirection of surplus, in decisions made far away. Those are harder to photograph, harder to explain, easier to ignore. As the empire enjoyed the benefits of this arrangement, dependency deepened. The colony became more integrated into imperial systems, not less. Each new railway tied regions more tightly to export routes. Each new port expanded capacity to send goods outward. Each new industry aligned production more closely with external demand. Development, paradoxically, reduced flexibility. The colony was becoming efficient at serving others, not itself. By the time cracks began to form, the illusion had already done its work. Confidence delayed scrutiny. Momentum discouraged reform. The system looked too productive to question, too profitable to adjust, too essential to risk changing. And so the question that mattered most went largely unasked. What happens when a system built for extraction faces limits? That question would soon move from theory to reality. And when it did, the very mechanisms that once made the empire appear unshakable would reveal how fragile the foundation truly was. The cracks did not arrive with noise or warning. They appeared quietly, almost politely, hidden inside paperwork and policy adjustments that sounded technical and harmless. Wartime pressure intensified across the empire's world. Costs rose faster than revenues. Supply lines stretched thinner. Every decision at the center carried the weight of urgency. Survival was no longer a distant concern. It was immediate, and when survival becomes urgent, restraint disappears first. The empire demanded more, not through speeches, but through mechanisms. More resources, more guarantees, more deferred payments framed as temporary necessities. The colony was told it must contribute again, just a little longer, just a little more. These demands were presented as accounting solutions, not political choices. That distinction mattered. Accounting feels neutral. Numbers feel objective. But behind every number was a decision about who would bear the cost. The colony was forced to finance survival, not through consent, but through control. Earnings from trade were no longer freely accessible. Revenues were frozen in external accounts. Payments owed to the colony were delayed indefinitely. What had once been framed as cooperation hardened into obligation. Local surpluses were redirected automatically, without negotiation. The system no longer asked. It took. This was the core mechanism, simple and devastating. Wealth earned in the colony could not return to the colony. It moved outward, recorded as imperial strength, while conditions on the ground tightened. Funds that should have supported local investment were counted as foreign reserves. Capital that could have expanded industry or stabilized prices was instead used to shore up distant balances. The colony became rich on paper and poor in practice. Think about the psychological effect of that arrangement. Production continued at full pace. Goods left ports daily. Yet shortages began to appear in local markets. Prices rose. Credit became harder to access. Savings lost value. Workers noticed that wages did not stretch as far as they once had. Merchants struggled to restock. Farmers faced rising costs with limited return. The system produced value, but blocked its circulation. Industries that should have matured remained trapped in dependency. Without access to accumulated capital, they could not modernize on their own terms. Without control over earnings, they could not absorb shocks. Without autonomy in trade and currency, they could not plan long-term. Each year of extraction delayed development further. What should have been a cycle of growth became a loop of constraint. The empire framed these measures as emergency controls. Wartime conditions, they said, required extraordinary action. Once stability returned, normal arrangements would resume. But emergency systems have a habit of becoming permanent when they prove useful. The controls worked. They stabilized imperial accounts. They reassured creditors. They allowed wars to be financed without immediate collapse. That success made reversal inconvenient. Temporary debt hardened into permanent obligation. Deferred payments were never fully released. Frozen earnings stayed frozen. Each extension justified the next. The language remained calm and procedural, but the impact was cumulative. Over time, the colony was no longer just contributing to imperial survival. It was underwriting it. Ask yourself a simple question. What happens when an economy produces value it is never allowed to spend? The answer does not arrive instantly. It unfolds slowly. Purchasing power erodes. Markets weaken. Investment stalls. People work more hours for diminishing returns. Confidence fades, not with panic, but with fatigue. That fatigue spreads quietly through households, businesses, and institutions. As prices rose, the strain became harder to ignore. Inflation was not an accident. It was a natural outcome of constrained supply and limited financial flexibility. When earnings cannot circulate freely, scarcity follows. When scarcity meets demand, prices climb. The colony absorbed these pressures internally, while financial stability was preserved externally. Pain was localized by design. Savings were hit particularly hard. Money set aside by workers and merchants lost value as prices climbed and access tightened. Without stable instruments to protect wealth, small accumulations vanished. This was not dramatic theft. It was erosion, slow enough to avoid revolt, steady enough to reshape society. Economic insecurity became normal. The empire survived each crisis by tightening the grip. Each new shock justified another layer of control. Trade restrictions deepened. Financial oversight expanded. Autonomy narrowed further. From the imperial perspective, these measures were rational. They preserved order. They prevented collapse. From the colony's perspective, they felt suffocating. What made resistance difficult was the system's complexity. There was no single lever to pull, no single law to repeal. Control was distributed across institutions, agreements, and procedures. Responsibility was diffuse. Accountability was distant. Even when discontent grew, it struggled to find a clear target. The harm was structural, not personal. Meanwhile, the empire's narrative remained confident. It spoke of resilience, of shared sacrifice, of long-term vision. It pointed to continued production as evidence that the system still worked. And in a narrow sense, it did. Goods continued to flow. Accounts remained balanced. Wars were funded. The machine kept running. But machines consume what they run on. And this one was consuming its foundation. The turning point came not with rebellion, but with realization. It became clear that the controls were not receding. That wartime measures were becoming peacetime norms. That the colony's role was fixed, not transitional. It was no longer moving toward autonomy. It was being managed indefinitely as a resource pool. This realization changed how the system was experienced. What had once felt like delay now felt like denial. What had once seemed like partnership now looked like extraction. The promise of eventual balance lost credibility. People began to understand that the wealth they generated would not return in proportion. That understanding altered expectations, behavior, and trust. Markets responded to trust as much as to policy. As confidence weakened, efficiency declined. Informal systems emerged to cope with constraints. Hoarding increased. Speculation spread. These were not moral failures. They were adaptive responses to a system that restricted legitimate circulation. When formal channels closed, informal ones opened. The empire responded with more control. Regulation tightened. Oversight increased. Each response addressed symptoms, not causes. The underlying mechanism remained untouched. Value continued to flow outward. Local capacity continued to weaken. The colony's economy was no longer just constrained. It was being hollowed out. This hollowing had long-term consequences. Infrastructure existed, but maintenance lagged. Industries operated, but innovation stalled. Labor was abundant, but underutilized. The economy functioned, but without momentum of its own. It was alive but dependent, productive but fragile. What saved the center was destroying the periphery's future. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this chapter. The empire did not act out of malice. It acted out of fear. But fear-driven systems rarely produce balanced outcomes. They prioritize immediate survival over sustainable relationships. By the time this became undeniable, the system had gone too far to easily reverse. Releasing controls risked financial shock. Returning reserves threatened stability. Allowing full autonomy challenged imperial leverage. Every option carried risk, and so the path of least resistance prevailed. Extraction continued. The colony's economy was now caught in a trap. It produced value for others while losing capacity for itself. It carried the weight of decisions it did not make. It paid for wars it did not choose. It absorbed costs without sharing control. The imbalance was complete. This was no longer a sustainable arrangement. It could persist for a time, but only by draining more from the same source. The foundation was weakening. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were structural. And once structures begin to fail, collapse is not a question of if, but when. Collapse did not arrive with a headline or a single dramatic decision. It arrived the way exhaustion does, quietly, after years of strain that never quite broke the surface. The system kept functioning, but without strength. The colony's economy still moved, but it no longer recovered. Each cycle of production ended with less capacity than before. Each year closed with tighter margins, thinner buffers, and fewer options. When control finally loosened, it was not an act of generosity. It was an admission of limits. The empire reached a point where maintaining the system cost more than it returned. Wars had ended or transformed. Global conditions shifted. The machinery of extraction, once essential for survival, became a liability. But the damage was already done. When authority receded, it left behind an economy shaped entirely around serving external needs. The colony did not inherit freedom with strength. It inherited freedom with fatigue. What remained was infrastructure without capital. Railways crossed the land, but there were no reserves to modernize them. Ports stood crowded, but lacked the financial autonomy to redirect trade on favorable terms. Industries existed, but many were locked into low-value production with little room to climb. The systems that govern finance, trade, and currency had been designed for control, not resilience. They were efficient at extraction, not at recovery. The colony faced the task of rebuilding without the wealth it had created. Decades of surplus had flowed outward. Savings that could have funded education, innovation, and diversification were gone. Institutions had been trained to obey, not to adapt. Markets had learned dependence, not initiative. This was not simply an economic setback. It was a structural handicap imposed over generations. Independence, when it arrived, carried heavy expectations. People believed control would immediately translate into prosperity. The reality was harsher. Economic freedom does not erase structural weakness overnight. It exposes it. Without capital buffers, small shocks became major crises. Without diversified industry, global price changes hit harder. Without trusted financial systems, investment hesitated. Meanwhile, the empire moved on. It had survived. That was the original objective. Its currency stabilized. Its debts were managed. Its global position adjusted, but endured. The cost of that survival was not calculated in its own ledgers anymore. It had been externalized. The colony bore in slower growth, persistent inequality, and fragile institutions. The aftermath reshaped politics in profound ways. Distrust replaced loyalty. Promises once made in the language of partnership were remembered as instruments of control. Economic hardship fueled political anger. Borders hardened. Identities sharpened. The economic story became a political one, as it always does when material conditions fail. Globally, the consequences extended further. Financial systems learned that extraction could be framed as cooperation, that emergency controls could be normalized, that power could be exercised through currency and trade more efficiently than through armies. These lessons did not disappear with empire. They were absorbed into modern economic practices. Think about how often the same language still appears. Temporary measures. Shared sacrifice. Stability first. Growth later. Strong centers leaning on productive edges in times of crisis. Insisting it is necessary. Insisting it will not last. History suggests otherwise. Systems built to manage emergencies tend to survive the emergency. And once they do, they reshape relationships permanently. The colony's experience explains why the modern world is divided by unequal starting lines. Some economies begin with capital, autonomy, and flexibility. Others begin with infrastructure but no reserves, labor but limited leverage, and markets conditioned to serve external demand. These differences are not accidental. They are the legacy of systems designed for survival, not fairness. This story also challenges a comforting myth. That exploitation requires cruelty or chaos. In reality, some of the most damaging systems are orderly, legal, and quiet. They operate through rules rather than force, through procedures rather than violence. By the time their impact is visible, they feel inevitable. Empires do not always fall when they collapse others. Sometimes they endure by doing so. That endurance, however, carries consequences that echo long after the balance sheets are closed. Economic scars shape politics, social trust, and opportunity for generations. They influence how societies view power, cooperation, and risk. The final lesson is uncomfortable but essential. Survival strategies leave marks. When power prioritizes itself without limits, it transfers risk downward and outward. The bill does not vanish. It is simply deferred, often to those least able to pay it. And when the moment of reckoning arrives, it rarely looks like justice. It looks like struggle. So the question lingers, long after the empire has adjusted and the colony has moved on. When survival depends on sacrifice, who decides whose sacrifice counts? Who benefits from stability, and who absorbs its cost? History offers an answer if you are willing to listen closely. If this story changed how you see power, economics, and history, subscribe for more deep cinematic explorations like this, and share with others who want to understand how the world we live in was truly shaped.